about him after death, then it would be nothing but blind belief. But in this text, the claims that it makes is something that you can understand and verify in the light of your own experience. So, having said that, as the general framework of how we approach the text, it's a text that reveals the highest truth. And it also reveals what are the methods, the practices. Its answer is called sadhana. What are the spiritual practices and qualifications that are required for somebody not merely to intellectually understand this teaching, but that they can verify it deeply in their own experience. This is what the Bhagavad Gita is. Of all the texts in India, there's no text like this. If you had to study one book of all of the ocean of books, I would say this book is probably the greatest. The reason for this is because there are texts called the Upanishads, which this philosophy in fact is based on. But the Upanishads don't talk much about what you have to do to realize the truth that they're talking about. There's just short little dialogues in the Upanishads. Some student comes to some teacher and says, teach me the truth, or give me immortality. And the teacher says some things, and at the end of the discussion, the student says, thank you, I have now realized the truth. Or he says, thank you, I've now become immortal. But we don't understand how that teaching made him immortal, because we just read the teaching ourselves, and we don't seem that understanding that teaching makes us immortal. The explanation for this is because you haven't understood the teaching properly. You're not qualified to understand the teaching properly. This teaching can't be understood by everybody, even if they've heard it 100 times. So there are qualifications, and the Bhagavad Gita is like the Boy Scout handbook. If you really want to know the practical life of someone who might really want to truly realize what's being taught here, not merely as a curiosity, but as a burning desire to truly want to know what is this thing they're talking about, to realize it, then there are qualifications. And the Bhagavad Gita explains those in quite beautiful detail. And if we understand the whole text as something that teaches the highest truth that we can verify here and now in this very life, and that it also teaches us how to become qualified to realize that truth. That's how we'll approach the text. So, this Bhagavad Gita is a book that consists of 18 chapters, but it's embedded in a much bigger book that's called the Mahabharata, which means the Great War of India. And historically, there's good reason to believe there was some great war that took place in India. But nevertheless, this book is describing that war, how it came about, and who was the players, and who were the kings, and it goes on and on. They say there's 100,000 verses now. The book has grown over the years. People added stories, interpolations, the Mahabharata only had 8,000 verses. And then it went to 25,000 verses. And now we have 100,000 verses. In those 100,000 verses is inserted, there is a text that's called the Bhagavad Gita that only has 700 verses out of the 100,000. So it's a small part of the whole Mahabharata that's describing this war. Without getting into all the details, the story takes us to the point that the war is about to start. And the warrior, Arjuna, has this dilemma. He tells his charioteer, Krishna, the Supreme Lord of the universe, please don't fall off your feet. How is he the Supreme Lord of the universe? We'll have to just suspend our vertical faculties for the time being. He's the Lord of the universe, and he brings Krishna into the middle of the battlefield. And Arjuna is overcome by two things: delusion and grief. That's the two things that he has. He says, I'm deluded and I'm grieving. Why is he grieving? All those people on the other side of the battlefield, he has to kill. And they're his cousins, his uncles, his teachers, his relatives. The people, which he kills, he doesn't even want to keep them. So now he's deluded. What should I do? What shouldn't I do? I'm grieving. I don't want to spill the blood of people that I respect. I ask you, Krishna, you teach me. What is the highest good? I want to know what will bring me the greatest benefit. That's my question. I'm in delusion and I'm grieving. I'm in ignorance and I'm grieving. And I want you to tell me what will bring about my greatest good. This is the setup for the Bhagavad Gita. That setup takes us to the second chapter, the 11th verse, where Krishna begins his teaching. He wants to tell Arjuna how to put an end to his ignorance and put an end to his grief. Now let me just briefly tell you what this ignorance is and what this grief really is, according to the Gita. Ignorance is thinking that I am this body, mind, and senses, that I was born, I'm getting old, I'm going to get sick, and I'm going to die. That I'm the doer, that I'm the enjoyer, that I'm the knower, and that I'm the one who's going to kill those guys over there, or they're going to kill me. This is called avidya, ignorance. Arjuna was ignorant. Because of that ignorance, he was suffering. He was thinking, I'm going to have to kill them, or they're going to have to kill me. Grieving over this situation. First he was ignorant, and then because of that ignorance he was suffering. That same ignorance that Arjuna had, that I am Arjuna, I am this, and these are my people, this is mine, is a universal situation. Everybody believes I am this, I am this body, and this is mine. My house, my wife, my money, my things. Talking over the shoulder of Arjuna, to us, the teaching is not to Arjuna. It's a universal teaching, because everybody has this exact same misconception. Bhagavad Gita is to remove this ignorance and the grief that has been causing us. If we understand it like that we're all ignorant of our true nature, of who we really are, and we not only don't know who we are, we have a mistaken notion about ourselves. I am this limited individual in the world, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, doing this, doing that. That idea, according to this Vedantic teaching, the Bhagavad Gita teaching, is wrong. And it's because of this ignorance that we grieve. So the beginning of the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita starts like this. Asochanam vasochisvam pragyambadavsya bhashase vatasuna katam suscha namasochati patitaha. Hey Arjuna, you grieve where you should grieve not, even though you seem to be speaking words of wisdom. The wise, those who know the true nature of the self, they neither grieve for the living or the dead. That's the first beginning of the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. You grieve where you should grieve not. The wise neither grieve for the living and the dead. So we don't know exactly, he just automatically states that. In the next shloka, I'm going to read now for a little bit. This is the beginning. The second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is called, the name of the chapter is entitled Samkhya Yoga. The word Samkhya means knowing a thing completely. Samkhya. Kya is a knowledge of something. Sam is complete. Samkhya is knowing a thing completely. Samkhya Yoga means the yoga where we know the self, its true nature. The Bhagavad Gita starts off right from the very beginning, presenting us with its idea of the true nature of the self, an idea that nobody else shares or believes. And he says in the next shloka, in the next verse, Natu evam jatu nasam. There never was a time, he's talking to Arjuna, he says, there never was a time when I was not. Krishna says this. There never was a time when I was not. And then he looks at Arjuna, he says, nor has there been a time when you were not. And then he points to the people on the other side of the battlefield, and he says, nor will there be a time when they were not. He goes on to say, nor will there ever be a time when we will cease to be. He's teaching Arjuna that the self in everyone is unborn and undying. That's the self that's taught in the Bhagavad Gita. He's just stating it dogmatically. We really don't have much reason to believe any of this. It's against our experience, at least apparently. And so, we just have to see, how is this going to be understood? But whatever it is, this is the teaching of the Gita, that the self in everyone is never born and never dies. The immortality of the self. So, from there he says, you see that first verse, the wise neither grieve for the living or the dead. It sounds like the wise people are callous. Why are they not grieving when a person dies? Why don't they grieve for living people that are in suffering? Why don't they grieve? Is it because they're callous and indifferent to the pains of the world? Or is it because the wise man in Vedanta doesn't see any birth or death? He only sees one reality that's unchanging, ever the same. That's the deep meaning of it. Not that the wise man is indifferent to people's sufferings or their death, but from his own point of view, the point of view that he's realized the true self, which never is born and never dies, and that's the only reality. We'll get to that later. How this is to be understood, we'll see how the Bhagavad Gita presents this. I should have a text that doesn't have the commentary so I can read it faster. The next verse says something a little confusing. It says, just as the embodied self has in the body childhood, youth, and old age, we all feel that I was a child, and then I was an adolescent, and now I am like this. That there was one I, that the I that was a youth that became an adolescent is now the I that's like this. What this means is that even though the body is constantly changing, that feeling of I in us always stays continuous. This is an important thing in this type of analysis, because if you want to find the true I, if there is such a thing as a true I, it would have to be something that never changes. Something that was there during my childhood, adolescence, and now, unchanging. If there is such a thing, that I that doesn't change, even though the body's changing, the thoughts are changing, my senses are changing, is there something that never changes in me? That would be the I, the self, that is being indicated here. Then, in the next sloka, a slight change takes place. He tells Arjuna that all of these things that we experience with our senses, they produce heat and cold, pleasure and pain. They come and they go. So he advises Arjuna that you should learn to tolerate them. They're unavoidable, and therefore they should be tolerated. That's the advice in the 14th sloka. These come and go, they are fleeting. Heat and cold, pleasure and pain. The man who these do not agitate, who is the same in pain and pleasure, and who is wise, the Sanskrit word here is dhiraha. The person who is a dhira actually means someone who is always reflecting on what is changing and what is not changing. That's called a dhiraha. That person, he becomes fit for immortality. Because when Arjuna asked Krishna, I want the highest good, the highest good in this teaching is not a new car, or a beautiful new house, or any object in the world, in fact. The highest good here is called immortality, amritam. Infinite bliss is what is called the highest good. In Indian culture, back in those days, they said that there were 4 things that a person could attain in life. One was called dharma. That means righteousness. It's important to lead a righteous life. That was one of the goals of human life, to become righteous. Do the right thing, avoid the wrong thing. Dharma. The second thing was artha. That means the second goal of life was to accumulate wealth or material possessions so that you can live. Food, clothing, shelter. The things of the world is artha. That's also a goal of human life. The third was called kama, desire, to fulfill our desires. And the fourth goal of human life was called moksha, liberation. This goal of liberation, immortality, was considered the highest goal. Not everybody pursued that goal in the culture of the society, but the cultural understanding was that that was the highest goal of human life, to attain immortality, to become liberated from all suffering. There was a belief in the culture that this was possible, and that this was truly the highest goal of human life. In that context, wealth was supposed to be used to lead a righteous life. And desire, kama, was to be slowly directed towards liberation. So this immortality is called shreyas. It's the highest goal. Unlike worldly attainments, the Sanskrit word is called prayas, worldly happiness. In the Upanishad, there's a dialogue between 2 people, a teacher and a student. And the student says, teach me the self. Does it live after the body goes, or is it destroyed with the body? So the teacher, this is in an Upanishad, the teacher in this case was the god of death. His name was Yama. And Yama says to the student, don't ask me this question. Even the gods are confused about this. Please don't ask me this. Ask me anything else. Because he had promised the student 3 wishes, and the last wish was for this. He says, I'll give you women, I'll give you land, homes, reign over kingdoms, but don't ask me this. And supposedly the student, his name was Nechiketa, says, you know, if the gods don't even know this, and you're offering me all of this, this knowledge must be worth more than all of that. So you keep that, and you answer my question. That's my third boon. That's my third wish. practice, in fact, that the mind has to settle down, and if the slightest things in life are totally agitating you, that type of mind is incapable of getting immortality. Because it's the mind that's the instrument by which we have to understand this teaching. A mind that has become quiet, pure, and introvert. And all of the practices you'll see as it goes are ultimately for that purpose. In the 16th verse, all of a sudden, he reveals to Arjuna a certain rule. You can call it a rule or a dictum that is accepted in Vedanta. And it goes like this. Na sakto vidyate bhava, na bhavo vidyate sattva. In English, that which is unreal has no existence. And that which is real never ceases to exist. The real never goes out of existence, and the unreal has no existence. I've been thinking about this sentence for about 40 years. There's a tremendous amount of implication to think about here. Krishna says, for the unreal, there's no being. There's no existence. That's not too controversial. Things that are unreal don't exist. They have no existence. A mirage in the desert. It's not real. So it has no existence. If you see a city in the clouds, it appears like a city, but it's not really a city. That city never existed. So for the unreal, there's no existence. Fine. The next part of the definition is, but for the real, whatever's real never has non-existence. Never goes out of existence. Well, if we take that as the definition of reality, that which never goes out of existence, then if I look at things such as every object that I see, including this body, there was a time when it wasn't existing. It exists now. There'll be a time when it won't exist. According to that definition, it can't be real. That which is real never changes, and that which is changing can't be real. Why is that the definition of reality? Because that's not normally the definition that I accept, that we all accept. What's the definition that we accept of reality? A thing is real if I can see it, touch it, smell it, taste it. If other people can see it, touch it, if it has causal efficacy, if it's a glass of water, it should quench my thirst, then it's real water. That's how I know what's real. And what I can't know by my seeing, hearing, touching, what other people know, that's unreal. So that should be the definition of reality. Whatever's known through a valid means of knowledge, like sight or hearing, the objects of those things are real. So Vedanta says, this teaching says, it's true. When we're awake, we see knock my head on the tree, it hurts. So the tree is real. But as soon as I wake up, all of those proofs were no proofs at all. It was just a dream. The dream was canceled. It changed. Now the waking appeared. So the criteria for reality should be that which never changes is real. The dream wasn't real because it got canceled. It may be also true that this waking state sometimes gets canceled. So the definition of reality here is that which never gets canceled, which can never be thought away, which can never come and go. And on that basis, we have to determine reality. I'm going to jump a step ahead here. Is there anything that's real? Everything seems to be changing. Everything outside that I see is changing. So, are you saying that everything outside is unreal? Not only that, this body is changing every second, every cell, and my senses are changing. My mind is certainly constantly changing. They must, according to that definition, all be unreal. In fact, maybe there's nothing that's unchanging. That there's no unchanging reality. Because when we examine, we find that I'm only aware of changes. Thoughts are changing, this body that I'm aware of is changing, the outside world is changing. Is there anything in all of this that's not changing? And this is the unique teaching of Vedanta, of the Bhagavad Gita. If you examine your own experience, you'll come to understand that that consciousness in you, to which all these changes are occurring, on the basis of which you say they're changing, that consciousness never changes. The consciousness in you that's aware of every change, of every phenomenon, of every thought, of every objective thing that's always changing, the only way you know that they're changing is because you're the unchanging light in which they're appearing and disappearing. That unchanging light, that unchanging consciousness, that unchanging knower, to which all the changes are known, which can never change. If that was changing, you wouldn't even know that things are changing. Because the only way to know that things are changing is because there must be some unchanging principle on the basis of which you say this came, this went. It's only because you're permanently there, unchanging, that you can say something arose, something abided, something disappeared. That unchanging light is the self. That's the only reality. Why? Because it never changes. And the definition of reality is that which never changes is real. And that which is changing can't be real. I don't know how many people are familiar with Buddhist philosophy, but they have a similar type of reasoning that's applicable here. They also argue that if a thing really had a true nature, if it really existed and had some true nature, accept that there's an unchanging consciousness. So based on their reasoning, they say because everything is changing, nothing has a true nature. Everything is empty. This is a Buddhist philosophy. But in Vedanta we say, I'm sorry, sir, there is one thing that never changes. That's not even in time, because time itself appears and disappears in that consciousness. That consciousness can change. It has no parts. It can't modify itself. It's not in space. It can't go anywhere. That consciousness that's in everyone, that's the self. When you know it, you'll know that you're immortal. That knowledge will bring about immortality. You'll know the immortal nature of your own self. It'll get rid of the idea that I was born, I'm getting old, I'm getting sick, and I'm going to die. A misconception. The self was never born, never dies. That's what he just said. There never was a time when I was not, when you were not, nor these warriors over there, nor will there be a time when we shall cease to be. He's talking about the witness in everybody. That consciousness that's always shining, ever present, never hidden. The self of everyone. Sarvasyatma. The same self in all beings. Ekatma sarvabhuteshu. One self in all beings. That witnessing consciousness never changes. And according to this definition in 216, that's the only reality. Everything else, even time and space, they appear and disappear. They can't be real. They can't exist without you, but you exist whether they appear or not. This immortal self, when you realize that, and that's the only reality. Nobody was born in reality. Nobody dies in reality. That's why the wise man doesn't grieve. Not because people are dying and he doesn't care, but because from his point of view, what you call birth is nothing but the self. What you call death is nothing but the self. The only reality is the self. There's nothing to grieve and nobody to grieve. This is the situation he finds himself in. So Krishna is trying to teach Arjuna this teaching. And he begins with this definition of reality. We have to see that that unchanging reality is our own self, the consciousness that lights up everything else. It doesn't need any light to light it up. It's in the light of the consciousness of your own self that everything is lit. But nothing lights that up. It doesn't need a light to light it up. It's self-shining, self-evident, self-manifest. That's the nature of the self. But in our ignorance, we all say, I, the self, am this. And that's where the teaching of the Gita begins. The 17th. In the beginning, what I think I'm going to do is to try to read a lot of the verses and give you the gist of what's happening. Mm-hmm. As we proceed, I'll just take, because we're not going to be able to do 700 verses of the Gita. That's not necessary. The purpose of these classes, I'm hoping, But there's a lot of people sitting in Paul and Evelyn's house now. So you have your witness, you have your witness, you have your witness. I'm witnessing my thoughts, you're witnessing your thoughts, I don't witness your thoughts, you don't witness my thoughts. So how many witnesses are there? How many realities are there? My witness must be real and never changes. And your witness must be real. So there must be two realities. But the self in Vedanta, that witness in you is one. There's only one witness. Because look how he describes it. Avinashi tu Dhamini. Know that to be indestructible, that witness in you, Nina Sarvamidam Tatam, by which all this is pervaded. That witnessing consciousness in you is not only pervading every thought, arises in that consciousness, abides in that consciousness, and sets in that consciousness. It's not only every thought, it's the whole universe is appearing in that consciousness. This body, this mind, this senses, this ego, along with all of the other so-called bodies and senses and minds and egos. They're all appearing in one consciousness. Sarvamidam Tatam, that pervades everything, like space. There's just one space that pervades everywhere. But we do talk about the space in the pot, the space in the vase, the space in the room, as though there are many spaces. Because the space is everywhere, it's in everything. It's in me, it's in you, but there's only one space. That's how the self is. Akashavat, like space. Gaganasatrisham, similar to space. Whenever they talk about the self, often the simile of space, because space has no parts. It never changes. It's infinite. We can never find the end of space. And the self is very similar to that, in that it's all pervading. It even pervades space. Space itself is an object of consciousness. The space is pervaded even by that. So this self, which pervades the whole universe, Sarvamidam, all of this, not just this body, but everything that's appearing, time, space, causality, universes, planets, galaxies, whatever we can be aware of, has to be in that one witnessing consciousness. So the self in me and the self in you is one self. And that's why there's a verse we'll come to in the Gita that says, he who sees himself in all beings. The self in me is the same self in you. The one who knows that truth, who sees himself in all beings. And all beings, that means me and you, in the self. That the self pervades the whole thing. He sees himself in all beings and all beings in himself. This is the one self of the Bhagavad Gita. A unique teaching of Vedanta. That there's only one self, even though it appears to be many. The self is one. The next line he says, so he said, know that to be indestructible by which all this is pervaded. None can destroy that which is immutable. That which has no parts. that perish. The bodies that perish. Remember in the previous verses he said anything that gets destroyed can't be real. The bodies get destroyed. According to that definition, they can't be ultimately real. Because what is real never perishes. These bodies that perish are said to pertain to the one who seems to be in the body. The self, which pervades everything, which is like space, but just like the cup, it seems to be in the cup, there's cup space. Every one of us are embodied cells because we've taken the space, which is infinite, and made it a limited thing by identifying it with this body, mind, and senses. And because of that, we call it the embodied self. The self is never embodied, just like space is never cut up just because of a cup. When you move a cup around, you say, oh, the cup space is here, the cup space is there. But space never moves, it's the cup that's moving in space. In the same way, that infinite one self, when it's associated with this body, is called the embodied self. So every body, all of us have bodies which is associated with that infinite self. And what he says is that the bodies perish, these bodies perish, and they pertain to the eternal self that is imperishable and never an object of knowledge, aprameya. The witness in us is never an object of knowledge. Whatever you think of is not the witness. You can't objectify it by thought because it has no qualities. It's not red or blue or green. The witness is not big or small. The witness has no characteristics. Whatever the mind thinks of, you're the witness of that thought. The witness can't be thought of. And so it's called aprameya. It's never an object of knowledge, but it's indestructible. And then a funny thing, he said to Arjuna. And therefore, because the indestructible, the self is indestructible, therefore, get up, fight, enter the battle. Now, this is a strange type of teaching. He's teaching him the immortality of the self, that it's never destroyed, that it pervades the whole universe. That even when the body perishes, it doesn't perish. And therefore, get up and fight. Now, I'll tell you a little side anecdote. You can think about this. I know I'm friendly with a very eminent Buddhist scholar who told me this Bhagavad Gita is a horrible text. And I said, why? How do you come to that opinion? And he said, because the Bhagavad Gita teaches, because everybody has an immortal self inside the body that can't be destroyed, it's okay to destroy people's bodies because you're not really destroying their real self. That's what the Gita is teaching. Because we all have an immortal self, it's okay to kill people. That's the teaching of the Bhagavad non-duality, because people are just their bodies, and you can't really kill the self. So it's okay to kill people. That's what the Bhagavad Gita teaches. This, I take, is a misunderstanding of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita has nothing to do with a battle or killing people or anything like that. This is just the setup, the story in which it's embedded. The whole purpose of the Gita is to remove a misconception we have about ourselves. So obviously the Gita preaches that there is a true self, and that self is unchanging. It doesn't kill anyone, nobody kills it. It pervades the whole universe. It has no parts. That's the nature of the self that's being taught. It's one. It's the only reality because it never changes. Because it's the only reality, nothing can kill it. And it can't kill anything because there's no other thing than the self. This is really what's known as the non-duality of the self. Mm-hmm. There's no two things here. The next verse, he says to Arjuna a question. How can a man, O Arjuna, who knows it as the imperishable, the eternal, the unborn, the unchanging, cause anyone to be slain? And whom can he slay? So, not only has Krishna taught Arjuna the nature, the true nature according to him of the self, he says that a person who knows it to be like that, when a person knows that myself is the one only reality that pervades the whole universe, that's the truth of the whole universe, which is constantly changing. When a person knows that, how can a man slay anyone, and how can he be slain when he sees only the self? This is the fruit of knowledge. Nobody can slay you, and you're never going to slay anyone. It puts an end to that misconception. Krishna gives Arjuna an example. How the self never changes, even though the body, it seems as though it takes on the body of a youth, it takes on the body of an adolescent, of an old man. The bodies are changing, but the self is the same. And he gives the example of worn-off clothes. Just like I take a new shirt and I put it on. The shirt is not me. After a while, the shirt gets worn out and I throw it away. I put on another shirt. It's called youth. I throw that away and I put on a shirt that's called old age. But the self is not the shirt. The self never changes. As the different shirts are changing, the shirt is just the body. The body is always changing. But the self that's associated with that body is unchanging. Let me just say a thing about the Bhagavad Gita. And, the word Gita means song. And Bhagavad means the Lord, or the Supreme Being. It's the song of the Supreme Being. So, since 500 BC, these 700 verses sound like a song. It's a philosophical song that has lasted through the ages. And I don't think it's a little difficult to share the beauty of the verses here, how it actually goes. But anyway, in 29 Chandati Chadrani Nainam Dati Pavata Nache Einam Vaidati Apo Natochati Mata. Here, Krishna says, this one, this self, this immortal, imperishable, real self, weapons cannot cut it. Fire cannot burn it. Water cannot wet it. And the wind cannot dry it. All of these things, in other words, if I take a sword, a knife, and I cut my skin here, I say, I am cut. But Krishna says, the self can't be cut. Weapons cannot cut the self. That witnessing consciousness in you, that's the witness of the body and the cut, can never be cut. It's kind of like when you're witnessing a dream. If somebody in that dream gets cut, you're not cut. Weapons cannot cut it. Fire can't burn it. Water can't wet it. Wind can't dry it. The self cannot be cut, burned, wet, or dried. 24. Why? It is eternal. Let me just say a word about eternal. There's two ways that you can understand eternal. One is that the self always existed in the past, and that it exists now, and that it will always continue to exist into the future, even though the body goes. The self is eternal in time. But the eternality of the self is not like that. It's not in time. It's the witness of time. It's beyond time. It's the transcendental reality that's not in time or space, which appear and disappear in consciousness. That's the meaning of eternal here means not in time. Never born, never dying, because it's not in time. How the self is not in time will be made clearer as we go. This whole Bhagavad Gita, by the way, it's one song. You can't just whip out some verse. In order for it to be a full song, you have to sing the whole song. So the whole Gita, in order to understand any real part of it, we'll have to plow through most of it. So, just as a forewarning, that whatever's being taught here is just a preliminary, because this is pretty dogmatic here. He had to prove that the self is immortal, and he really stated that things that never changes are real, but he hasn't shown us in our own experience what is it that thing that's never changing. So at this point, we have to just see what is the teaching of the Gita. It says the self was never born and never died. It is eternal, not in time or space. It is all pervasive. What that means is, it is everywhere. Wherever you go, wherever you travel, whether you're in your bed at night putting the cover over your head, or on a plane to Hawaii, or sitting in a cave in the Himalayas, that self is there, pervading the whole thing. There's no place you can go where it's not. It's a little bit like putting a lamp on the top of your head and going waking or dream, that consciousness is there. So it's all pervasive. Because it's all pervasive, there's not many of them. There's only one self that pervades everything. It's not that I have myself, you have yours. This characteristic of all pervasive makes it that the self is one. It is stable, kutastha. It never changes. Sometimes things are eternal, but they're always changing. You could say the universe is eternal, but it's always changing. Or you could say a mountain, it's been there forever, but it's slowly changing. But this is eternal and unchanging, immovable, everlasting is it. This is the description of the self in Vedanta. And when a person realizes it, not only does his ignorance go, all the grief that was caused by that misconception instantaneously is removed. Krishna goes on with the description of the self. He says, Avyaktoayam. This self is unmanifest. What does that mean? That the witness in you is never manifest. It never takes any form that you could be aware of. It's unmanifest. The world is manifest, but the witness in you is unmanifest. Unthinkable. Achintiyam. Whatever you think of is not it. Any concept you form is not it, because it's the witness of every concept. But no concept can objectify that. And that's why it's called Achintiyam. Before it was unknowable, aprameya. Same idea. Achintiyam. Imponderable, immutable. And then he says, when you know it to be such, when we know that our self is like this, that this is my true self, you will have no reason to grieve. Which shows that the purpose of the teaching is to put an end to the grief by removing the ignorance about the nature of ourselves. That's the Gita. Remove the misconception and all of the suffering that that misconception has caused us. In 26, he changes the subject. And I think at this point, this is a good point to conclude today's class.
Okay.
But here, he's going to jump to another